Now, why is it, even though these are annual events, we always act surprised when there's fire or water? The river just here being the dividing line between houses that are perfectly okay and houses that are incinerated. In their vehicles, any pets that remained, horses, dogs, you'll see the carcasses around of those abandoned last-minute evacuations because they couldn't put the horse in the car, of course. And a lot of them didn't have enough trailers. The roads were jammed. They had to make a choice last minute, and as horrible as it is, crews did come behind, and most of them were rescued. Budgets have fallen desperately behind most states in North America and most countries throughout the world because natural disasters have skyrocketed due to climate change. However, the budgets have not, and the expense, as most forces become less voluntary and require more and more professionalized teams with much higher costs and no inspection on their costs, so they can have 3,000% inflation, 300% inflation because they're the only one with the fire engine in the area who rents it to you, or because they're the only ones with the equipment necessary to pull you out of the fire. Then you have to pay pretty much any cost because you're paying emergency, last minute, last vehicle in town costs, as opposed to having a fleet ready to go. Professional armies of firefighters standing by to combat these massive, devastating wildfires. But we don't. We use voluntary forces, which are very adequate in many areas of the country and many areas of the world. However, in those areas with persistent wildfires, there's all the reason to have a professionalized team with a lower cost and vehicles on the standby when the season comes. Part of the reason also is the method, the strategies being deployed on the ground year to year and over decades making devastating effects. One is fire suppression. Having a law on the west coast of America where fires are frequent, that your strategy is always to suppress fire at all times, leads to the forest being filled with kindle. Ginormous kindle, when in nature lightning and various other artifacts would cause frequent fires on a smaller scale and prevent giant buildups of dead wood. Now, it's very controversial, the idea of having controlled fires, because what if they get out of hand? Which is a very good point. There is a lot of science to that. But I say leave it up to the scientists and the professionals, not the politicians on this matter. Politicians like the idea of no fire at all times, because it's the safest thing politically. It's the safest thing for re-election. But in terms of actual on-the-ground realities, ignoring, having a radical strategy of 100% fire suppression leads to devastating impacts. There's no politicians to be seen. There's no politicians around here. There are, however, propane tanks you notice that your neighbors have, which would kind of suck to live next to if you're right here, or right there, and there's a wildfire coming, because your house is going down. Because that thing must have took out a hell of an explosion. Not just that, the gas lines and such throughout the area, as well as just, fire falling from high trees. So we have to decide, are we going to always act surprised when there's a flood, and act surprised when there's a fire, as global warming intensifies, until we have any substantial international agreements that are being held to and any real progress being made on climate change? We must understand that we have to invest much more in the prevention strategies for our communities and not neglecting them and just letting, ducks lie. Filled with kindling, fall upon small communities who have no means with their small voluntary force to possibly defend against a raging wildfire. It's not their fault. They're not responsible. But there are those who are. Those who suppressed the fires for decades. Politicians who have long died. And the generations that came after them. The people who decided that fire departments didn't need a budget increase for 30, 40 years. Now, the federal government did pass the increase in budgets for firefighting recently, which is great. But it's not nearly enough. And also, it's not just about throwing money at the problem, it's that actually investigating whether those wildly inflated costs for using airplanes with fertilizer and using privatized teams that you call for 3 or 4 months a year, whether that's effective or whether smaller professional forces of full-time people that can be supplemented to a much lesser extent, that will require planes to a much lesser extent, which won't require as extreme measures because it's a day-to-day interaction and they can immediately get on top of these fires without having to rally a team and pay exorbitant costs. Now, it's easy to say, oh, we need a professional firefighting force. But that's what a lot of countries have used to great effect. It's not a revolutionary concept. It's a very realistic concept, and one of the best ways to both fight fires effectively, fight them long term, fight them with broader strategies that are actually decade to decade dependent and with better cost points. Having a mercenary force and a giant mercenary statistical force instead of having a government-based forecasting, so using private industry forecasts, private industry to solve it last minute, and then using lobbyists to affect the budgets of federal governments and diverting the funds away from natural disasters, all ends up with a privatized system with a bunch of fractures in it and nothing with a holistic approach to fire and water, environmental damages and disasters that affect all communities and will one day come to touch your life as well.